In this video, we're going to talk about bacteria. There are about 30,000 different bacterial species that we know about. 99% of all of these bacteria are beneficial, either to living things or to the environment, for recycling nutrients or for existing in and on us. In the human body, there are 10 times more bacterial cells in and on us compared to human cells. And we need to have these organisms. We call them normal flora, or sometimes microflora. Sometimes there are yeast organisms which are part of the fungus kingdom, but the majority of these microorganisms that are beneficial to us are bacteria. About 1 square inch of skin can contain about 500,000 bacterial organisms, and we need these to help us do all kinds of things. We can use some bacterial organisms to make cool foods like cheese and yogurt and kombucha. If you've ever had that, is pretty yummy. Sauerkraut or kefir, any of those kinds of foods contain microorganisms. When those foods contain bacteria, we call them probiotic foods. Probiotic foods help to replenish the microorganisms in our digestive tract. It's very healthy to eat probiotic foods. Another term that I want to point out is prebiotic. A prebiotic is food for the bacteria. Our intestinal bacteria, they like to eat fiber. So it's very beneficial to eat fruit and vegetables because it helps to feed your intestinal bacteria and it keeps them healthy and they can do lots of great things for us. Some of the effects of normal flora. They regulate our immune system. So early in life, we begin to populate our body with bacterial organisms, and this all begins when we're born. And then over periods of time, different species develop and grow, almost like growing a forest, how there's different organisms, and as the forest gets mature, there's different kinds of diversity of organisms. We want that to happen in our digestive tract because it helps our immune system to tolerate food molecules. It helps our immune system learn to figure out what it should attack and what it shouldn't attack. Intestinal bacteria help prevent the growth of harmful bacteria. We eat all kinds of microorganisms, and having a healthy intestinal normal flora helps to prevent infection from other bacterial organisms. Bacteria help to produce vitamins like vitamin K and some of the B vitamins. They release minerals from plant foods. And they stimulate our intestinal cells to grow, so it helps to maintain a healthy intestinal lining. And normal flora can also metabolize some carcinogens, and they can break down some toxic molecules before we absorb them. In another video, we looked at the structures that you would find in a typical prokaryotic organism. Bacteria are prokaryotic organisms, so they have a very simple cell structure. They do not have membrane-bound organelles. They have a nucleoid region with 1 chromosome, and they don't have a nucleus. They have ribosomes that help synthesize proteins, cytoplasm that contains dissolved nutrients, and they have a plasma membrane, which is composed of phospholipids just like our cell membranes, but the membrane proteins embedded in that membrane might be a little bit different. And bacteria can have a cell wall, which is not the same kind of cell wall as plants. It is not made of cellulose like plant cell walls. It's made out of a molecule called peptidoglycan, and we'll look at that in a second. Some bacteria also have an extra layer composed of protein called a capsule. Some bacteria can have extra structures. Pili are for exchanging DNA. So if there was an extra plasmid molecule, some bacteria have these plasmid structures, which is a small DNA molecule that can contain genes. that can be replicated and transferred through pili between different bacterial organisms. And flagella used for locomotion. When we look at the membrane structure of bacteria, we can categorize them into gram-positive or gram-negative bacteria. And this is based on if they can stain with a dye. If they do stain, then they are gram-positive and they don't have this extra lipopolysaccharide layer. If they have lipopolysaccharide, then they don't stain, so we call those gram-negative. So we'll just take a look at what these look like. Here we have our plasma membrane in bacteria that look just like our plasma membranes. There's phospholipid heads, fatty acid tails, and it's a bilayer because there are 2 rows of phospholipids and there are membrane proteins. And then we have this extra carbohydrate layer called peptidoglycan, which can also contain different kinds of proteins or carbohydrate groups. So this is the cell wall. And over here, and these are gram-positive bacteria. And over here we have gram-negative bacteria. They also have a bilayer cell membrane with proteins. They have a smaller peptidoglycan cell wall, and they have this extra membrane called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. So this looks like the phospholipid bilayer, but there are extra polysaccharide molecules attached to these. So these are gram-negative. Gram-negative bacteria have lipopolysaccharide. Sometimes bacteria have an extra way that they can survive really harsh environments, and they can form endospores. Not all bacterial organisms can do this, but some of them can. One example is botulism. Botulism is a type of bacteria that lives in the soil, and if we pick vegetables and we can them or jar them, then in that anaerobic environment, botulism can survive and start to produce a toxin. So you got to make sure you're doing your canning and jarring properly to kill those organisms. But some organisms can form this endospore and they can live for really long periods of time in harsh environments. When we have round bacteria, they are called cocci. And if they are in groups of 2, we call them diplococci. If they are in clusters, we call them staphylococci. And if they are in strings or strands, then we call them streptococci. Some bacterial organisms have this oblong shape, and we call those bacilli. And some of them have this spiral shape, and they are spirochetes. So those are the 3 general categories of shapes of bacteria. In other videos, we have talked about antibiotic resistance. When bacteria have that extra plasmid piece of DNA, sometimes it can contain genes that make them resistant to antibiotics. And then antibiotics that are normally a selection pressure that normally kill bacteria, then antibiotics won't kill those bacteria if they have these special genes on their plasmid. So how antibiotic resistance genes work, they can be different proteins. So remember, DNA codes for RNA that codes for a protein. If they have resistance genes, they can produce proteins that form either in the cell or in the membrane that either break down the antibiotic or pump the antibiotic out of the cell or have some mechanism for getting rid of the antibiotic so it doesn't kill the bacteria. So this diagram is showing some different mechanisms of how antibiotic resistance genes can work. They can produce proteins that will, so this is showing an antibiotic, and it's going to come into the cell, and the DNA might alter what that antibiotic binds to. So if it changes the shape of this protein, then it basically doesn't function. So it can alter the DNA, the resistance DNA can alter the target site of the antibiotic. If it can't fit in and do what it's supposed to do, then it can't kill the bacteria. Sometimes the DNA will produce a membrane protein or a pump that will just move the antibiotic out of the cell so it can't hurt the bacteria. Sometimes it can produce enzymes that will inactivate the antibiotic, so then the antibiotic is chopped up and it can't function. Or it can have alternate pathways. So let's suppose the antibiotic is supposed to bind to some kind of a protein that has some kind of an effect. If this protein is altered, then this chemical reaction cannot occur. Bacteria can share DNA. So one bacterial organism that has a plasmid with resistance genes, it can share that DNA. It can copy it. It can transfer it through a pilus to another bacterial organism. And then that organism has the antibiotic resistance genes as well. So in an environment where there is antibiotics, then those bacteria are going to keep those genes because it's a survival benefit to have that DNA. Sometimes bacteria can have multiple genes that will give it antibiotic resistance to multiple different kinds of antibiotics. Then we call that a multi-resistant bacterium or a superbug. And more of these are coming about because the more antibiotics that exist in a population of bacteria, the more those bacteria are going to hold on to those resistance genes. There are lots of infections that are becoming antibiotic resistant. It's a pretty important healthcare issue. Infections like Salmonella and Campylobacter, which we'll talk about shortly, also E. coli or chlamydia and sexually transmitted infections, a lot of those are becoming multi-resistant. There are two major factors that contribute to this problem. One of them is people being prescribed antibiotics when they don't need them. If you have a viral infection, let's suppose you have a viral bronchitis. If you are prescribed antibiotics for a viral infection, they don't work. They don't do anything. But those antibiotics will still impact your normal flora. And they can still acquire resistance genes that they can then share with other bacteria. Bacteria can share DNA with other bacterial species. They don't have to be the same species. The other problem is in the food industry. So farm animals housed in close quarters are more likely to spread infections to each other, so they are often given prophylactic antibiotics to try to prevent bacterial infections. Prophylactic means that you're trying to prevent an infection. So the overuse of antibiotics means that that selection pressure stays in the environment and bacteria keep those resistance genes. Another concept that I want to talk about is called an opportunistic infection. Opportunistic infections can occur either from bacteria, viruses, fungus, or parasites. And opportunistic basically means that those infections are going to affect people where there is an opportunity. That means people that are immunosuppressed. Okay, there's a few different kinds of situations where opportunistic infections are going to be a problem for some people. So the situations where opportunistic infections can be an issue are when people have a suppressed immune system or an inhibited immune system. Things like huge amounts of stress, being a newborn, being elderly, those kinds of situations, people don't have the best functioning immune system. If you don't have healthy, normal flora to help fight off pathogens, people that are malnourished don't have enough nutrients or protein to make the immune system function properly. Cancer patients taking chemo or radiation have an increased risk of opportunistic infections. There are people that take immunosuppressive medication, for example, people with autoimmune diseases, where they're trying to decrease the immune response. people with immunodeficiency like HIV, or a damaged skin barrier. So say, for example, someone having surgery where you open up the skin, that leaves a doorway for some infections to occur. So opportunistic infections do not normally affect healthy people with healthy immune systems and healthy normal flora, but people that are vulnerable have an increased risk of getting infections from things that wouldn't normally infect people. Okay. Now, we're going to go through a few examples of different species of bacteria that can cause infections. Okay, so remember that most bacteria are actually beneficial and good for us, and we want to have healthy normal flora, but sometimes there are infectious organisms that can make us sick. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or sometimes just called MRSA. This is a normal flora organism that can actually get out of control. We normally have some Streptococcus and Staphylococcus organisms on our skin, but when these organisms grow where they're not supposed to, then they can cause a problem. Injuries to the skin or sometimes surgery leaves an opening for MRSA to get in. It can infect the blood. Again, that can happen through surgery or puncture wounds. And it can infect the respiratory system, causing a type of pneumonia, and sometimes the urinary tract, causing a urinary tract infection. This is a very common nosocomial or hospital-acquired infection. It is considered a superbug or a multi-resistant. Methicillin is a very strong antibiotic. Staphylococcus aureus that is resistant to methicillin can make us very sick. It will more commonly infect people that are immunosuppressed. So people in hospitals are exposed to these microorganisms, plus they're immunosuppressed or they're having surgery. And it can cause necrotizing fasciitis, which is flesh-eating disease. Vancomycin resistant Enterococcus. Vancomycin is another type of antibiotic, and entero means the digestive tract. So this is a microorganism that will most commonly infect the intestines, sometimes the urinary tract. But this is a very common diarrhea infection in people that have had antibiotics. When people take antibiotics, it kills the normal flora as well as the infection. Sometimes you need to, and then when you're done the antibiotics, you make sure you eat probiotics or take probiotic supplements and, replenish your normal flora. But sometimes vulnerable people, like elderly people in nursing homes or people in hospitals, having antibiotics can sometimes trigger this vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus. It can be severe in people that are quite immunosuppressed. And here we have chlamydia and gonorrhea. These are very common sexually transmitted infections. And these are both, you will notice that these descriptions look exactly the same. They are very difficult to tell apart. The symptoms look very similar, and they can infect similar areas, including sometimes the eyes, mouth, or throat. These are very common sexually transmitted infections that can be treated with antibiotics, but there are some antibiotic-resistant strains that do exist. The symptoms can be anything from asymptomatic to burning and discharge. And that is for both males and females. So you can have these infections and transmit it and not know that you have it. A complication that can occur is called pelvic inflammatory disease, and this can occur in females, and this can make females infertile if it's not treated. Next, we have Streptococcus pyogenes. This is known as our strep throat. Very common infection. We have Streptococcus bacteria that live on our skin all the time, in our throat and mouth, and it's very common. It can overgrow and cause a mild strep throat, but it can also cause necrotizing fasciitis and blood poisoning, just like MRSA. So Streptococcus and Staphylococcus organisms can overgrow, and in people that have inhibited immune systems, they can have very severe infections. Also, high stress can trigger this. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but probably you've gotten sick more frequently when you've had a lot of stress, like writing exams, because stress will impact your immune function, and it actually inhibits the immune response. E. coli is an organism that is found in the large intestine of many organisms, including humans and animals that we eat. So when E. coli is in our large intestine, that is fine. But if we consume it and it ends up in our small intestine, then our body will react, and this can cause food poisoning. When cows are butchered, the steak and the roasts, they're all cut off first. And then there's bits of scraps of meat that are left on the carcass, and that becomes our ground beef. And sometimes the intestines of the cow can be broken open, and so E. coli can contaminate the ground beef, much more so than it would contaminate a steak. So ground beef needs to be cooked very thoroughly to make sure that we kill the E. coli and we don't consume it. Sometimes vegetables and fruit can be contaminated with runoff from farm fields where manure is used as a fertilizer. So we would need to wash our produce. E. coli can cause food poisoning, which can be anywhere from mild to severe, anything from nausea and vomiting, diarrhea. There are a couple of strains of E. coli that can be very severe and can leave the digestive tract and can cause kidney failure. Two more organisms that can cause food poisoning: Salmonella and Campylobacter. Both of these infect the digestive tract, and we can have some of these organisms living in our large intestine without causing any problems. But again, if we eat a large amount of it, then it can make us sick. So these are food poisoning microorganisms as well. Salmonella is a common organism found in animal intestines. It's often associated with undercooked chicken or raw eggs, but it can be in any kind of contaminated food or contaminated water. Campylobacter is probably the most common cause of food poisoning, and again from undercooked meat or contaminated water. And this one is also responsible for travelers' diarrhea. With all of the food poisoning bacterial organisms, Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter are the main ones. Those symptoms can range anywhere from not having very many symptoms to being really sick and spending 24 hours in the bathroom. It depends on a few different factors. Number one, it depends on the concentration of the organisms you've consumed. If you lick the spoon of raw cookie dough, which had a raw egg, which had some microorganisms, some salmonella, the concentration is likely so low that it's not going to affect you. If you have hydrochloric acid in your stomach, you have healthy microflora, you can eat a little bit and nothing will happen to you. But if you've left food on the counter for a really long time and it grows and those microorganisms multiply and you eat old food that has billions of bacteria, then you're going to get very sick. Okay, so concentration of microorganisms, how healthy is your intestinal bacteria, and how much hydrochloric acid you produce. You need to have enough hydrochloric acid to kill some microorganisms. And lastly, the ability of your immune system to be able to fight these pathogens off. So with food poisoning organisms, you can sometimes not notice anything, and sometimes you can be very sick. Another thing that I want to point out is that unpasteurized milk is a very nutritious environment for bacteria to grow. A lot of food poisoning bacteria have grown in unpasteurized milk, which is why we pasteurize milk. If you can get raw milk right from the cow, it's very healthy, but it can grow a lot of organisms in a pretty short period of time. The other thing that I want to mention is the 24-hour flu. So sometimes people get a vomiting kind of infection that lasts about 24 hours, and people call it the stomach flu or a stomach bug. Those can also be viruses. Not all vomiting and diarrhea conditions are because of bacteria. There's a class of virus called norovirus that can be easily spread, and they can also cause vomiting and diarrhea. And our last two organisms that we're going to look at, tuberculosis is still very prevalent in the world, and it infects several million people per year. And it kills about 50% of the people that are infected with it. So tuberculosis is airborne, and it can be transmitted through people that have active infection. People with tuberculosis can have non-active infection or a latent infection that can't be spread when they don't have symptoms. When people do have symptoms, it usually involves a cough with blood, and they have fever and weight loss. If you ever watch old movies and they talk about people dying of consumption, they're talking about tuberculosis. It makes you lose a lot of weight and you get very sick, and it's a long, slow, progressive infection. That's not fun. It's more common in developing countries than in developed countries. And our last infection is tetanus. Tetanus infects the central nervous system. And sometimes it's called lockjaw, and we get a vaccine for tetanus when we are young, and usually we have boosters every 10 years or so. And tetanus is an organism that produces a toxin, and it blocks inhibitory neurotransmitters, and it causes continuous muscle contraction. If you've ever seen old movies where there's like a possessed person that's arching their back and they're coming off the table and they're all like contracted, that actually used to be tetanus. People used to think that they were possessed, but it was bacteria. Now we can treat it with antibiotics. It only infects about 30 people per year, but generally most people are vaccinated, so we don't have to worry about it. The most common mode of transmission would be through a skin puncture. So look at the downloadable worksheet. There are microorganisms and symptoms or characteristics. Check out the worksheet and see if you can match up the disease with the characteristics.